I never thought a piece of land would cause so much trouble. When I first bought it, I imagined quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, the sun reflecting off the little pond at the edge of the property, and maybe a small garden I could tend to on weekends. It was my dream, my escape from the chaos of city life. Life was simple, peaceful, and predictable until HOA Karen decided it was. At first, she seemed harmless. She waved when I walked by, made small talk about the weather, and occasionally mentioned community rules in passing. I didn't think much of it. Everyone likes a friendly neighbor, right? But slowly I noticed the shift. She would show up at the mailbox to check on compliance, ask questions that didn't seem necessary, and always had that little smirk like she was testing me. I shrugged it off, assuming it was harmless. Then the letters started. At first they were small and mostly irrelevant, a reminder about lawn height, a notice about some minor restriction I hadn't even noticed. I tossed them in a pile and laughed. Well, that's annoying, but it's nothing, I told myself. But the pile grew, the letters became more frequent, the fines larger, and the complaints stranger. One morning I found a notice taped to my front gate declaring that my mailbox color was non-compliant with community standards. I stared at it in disbelief. My mailbox was red, I liked red. Apparently HOA Karen didn't. I began noticing her more often. She would stroll past my property, clipboard in hand, pretending to casually inspect the fence lines. I could see her talking to neighbors, pointing toward my land with a knowing look. Her presence felt heavier than before, almost suffocating. It was subtle at first, just little micro moments, but then it escalated. One afternoon, as I was trimming a hedge near the property line, she appeared completely unannounced, holding a stack of papers so thick it looked like she had brought the entire HOA office with her. I froze, hedge clippers midair, as she marched toward me. "You're in violation of multiple HOA rules," she announced, waving the papers like she was conducting some grand performance. "And if you don't comply, there will be consequences." I blinked, unsure if I should laugh or call her bluff. "Consequences? What exactly are we talking about here?" I asked, trying to sound casual while my heart rate shot up. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she leaned in, lowered her voice, and said, "You know exactly what I mean. Fines, legal action, eviction if necessary." Eviction from my own land? I must have misheard. "Excuse me," I said, stepping back, clutching the hedge clippers like a shield. She smirked, obviously expecting resistance. "This property falls under HOA jurisdiction. You must comply or leave," she said. Her confidence was infuriating. It was like she believed she had the power to rewrite reality with just a few words. I didn't know whether to panic, laugh, or pull out my phone and record the moment. Instead, I did the one thing I could. I stayed calm. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," I said slowly, trying to maintain control. "This is my property. I bought it legally and I plan to stay." She narrowed her eyes and waved her papers again. "The HOA has the authority, you'll see soon enough." And with that, she turned on her heel and marched down the driveway, clipboard swinging like a weapon. I watched her go, a mix of amusement and unease bubbling in my chest. I realized then that this wasn't going to be a simple neighborly dispute. This was the start of a full-blown war. A wave of adrenaline mixed with a strange sense of anticipation. I needed to prepare, document, and most importantly, stay one step ahead. Something told me that HOA Karen had no idea she was about to meet her match. That evening, I sat on my porch, staring at my land in the fading light, and wondered how it had come to this. A piece of land that I thought would bring peace had turned into a battlefield. But I wasn't about to back down, not now, not ever. Karen wanted a fight, fine, I was ready. The next morning, I wasn't sure if I should brace myself for another visit from Karen or hope she had decided to give up. I should have known better. She arrived at my gate just as the sun was creeping over the horizon, wearing that same pink blazer that seemed far too cheerful for what was about to happen. In one hand, she held a stack of papers thicker than a phone book, and in the other, an air of authority so exaggerated it was almost comical. "You need to vacate this property immediately," she announced, her voice carrying across the yard like a drill sergeant on a mission. "The HOA has determined that your residence here violates multiple regulations. You are being evicted." I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard. Evicted from my own land. The word sounded absurd even in my own head. I don't think that's how it works," I said, keeping my tone calm even as my pulse raced. "This is my land, I bought it legally. There's no eviction notice that can change that." Her expression shifted just slightly, as if she had expected me to break down in fear. Instead, I stood my ground, hands loosely by my sides, trying not to let her see that my stomach had tied itself in knots. "Oh, you'll see," she snapped, shoving the papers toward me. "The HOA has full authority. You can fight it all you want, but the process has already begun." I took the papers cautiously, flipping through them. Most of it was bureaucratic jargon, legalese that sounded impressive but didn't hold up to scrutiny. "These aren't even properly notarized," I muttered under my breath, trying to hide my small victory. Karen must have noticed because her smirk faltered for the briefest moment. "I've called the HOA officers," she added, as if that would intimidate me. "They'll be here shortly to escort you off the property if necessary." I couldn't help but let out a dry laugh. "Escort me off my own property? Well, I guess I'll need popcorn for this show." My tone was light, but inside, the adrenaline was climbing. I had prepared for confrontations, sure, but nothing like this, nothing with her acting like she owned the place. While we were talking, I noticed my neighbors peeking from behind fences and windows. Some were whispering to each other, others just shaking their heads in disbelief. I realized quickly that Karen's theatrics weren't going unnoticed. She thrived on the attention, I thought, which gave me an idea. I had to stay calm, collected, and maybe even throw in a few small sarcastic quips to throw her off. Minutes later, 2 officers from the HOA arrived, looking official and a little uncomfortable. Karen immediately brightened, pointing at me dramatically. "This is the individual I was telling you about," she said. "They are refusing to comply with HOA regulations. They need to be removed." The officers stepped forward, asking for the papers and for me to explain my side. I presented my documentation calmly, showing proof of ownership, records of property maintenance, and even evidence of her previous questionable complaints. Karen's face started to flush as the officers flipped through her stack of papers, murmuring among themselves. She tried to interrupt repeatedly, shouting over the officers, insisting that her authority was unquestionable. I kept my voice steady, occasionally adding small comments to highlight the inconsistencies in her claims. The tension in the air was thick. I could feel the entire neighborhood holding its breath, waiting to see how this would unfold. At one point, Karen stomped her foot as if that would somehow give her more power. The officers ignored her, and I could tell the balance was shifting. She was losing control, and that smug confidence she had worn like armor was cracking. By the time she realized the officers weren't going to back her up blindly, I had already started to feel the tide turn. She flailed, arguing louder, but every point she made was countered with calm logic and undeniable proof on my side. The absurdity of the situation was almost surreal. I was standing on my own land, being threatened with eviction by someone who had no legal standing, and the neighborhood was watching every moment. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I knew this was just the beginning of a war, but I also knew I had gained the upper hand. The officers were clearly taking me seriously now, and Karen had no idea what was coming next. And in that moment, as I stood in the morning sun, staring at her red-faced fury, I realized that I wasn't going to back down. Not today, not ever. This was my land, my rules, and if she wanted a fight, she was about to find out just how stubborn I could be. After that morning confrontation, I thought things might settle down, at least for a little while. I was wrong. Almost immediately, the letters and notices from the HOA started arriving at an alarming rate, each one more ridiculous than the last. One demanded that my lawn be trimmed to HOA-approved specifications, without specifying what that meant. Another complained that my birdbath was not in harmony with community aesthetics. I stared at it, blinking. Did Karen actually think I was going to sculpt my backyard to her taste? Every letter felt like a small jab, a way to remind me that she thought she had power over my life. At first, I laughed. I mean, how absurd could it get? But soon the absurdity turned into frustration. She wasn't just meddling, she was actively trying to make me miserable. Every day I noticed her driving past the property, clipboard in hand, inspecting every corner of my land as if she were searching for some invisible violation. Neighbors started noticing too. Some whispered that Karen had gone overboard, that her obsession with controlling the neighborhood was getting out of hand. Others seemed genuinely afraid to cross her, nodding nervously whenever she appeared. I, on the other hand, couldn't help but find a small, dark amusement in the situation. The more she tried to assert power, the more ridiculous she appeared. I began documenting everything. Photos of her standing on my driveway, videos of her packing along the fence, copies of every outrageous letter she sent. One afternoon, she appeared again, this time marching right up to the garden. "Your hedge is not compliant," she declared. I raised an eyebrow. "It's a hedge," I said. "It's green, it's growing, it's alive." She scowled like I had personally insulted her authority. "You must comply or face consequences," she hissed. Her voice had that unmistakable tone of someone who genuinely believed she was untouchable. I tried not to laugh. I wanted to tell her that consequences? Really? You're threatening me with fines for a hedge? But instead, I simply smiled politely, thanked her for the advice, and continued pruning. Even the neighbors were watching this unfold. Some came by, trying not to look amused as they saw Karen's over-the-top theatrics. It became clear that she thrived on the attention, that every visit was a performance meant to intimidate me and impress anyone watching. I realized that if I stayed calm and collected, I could make her look ridiculous without even trying. At night, I would sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, thinking about the next move. The situation was escalating and I knew it. Karen wasn't just an annoying neighbor, she was building up to something bigger. The constant letters, the daily inspections, the threats, all signs that she believed she had authority over me that she did not. I started preparing. I kept every document, every letter, every note. I took videos of her wandering the property, noted the times she showed up unannounced, and even started making small diagrams of the property lines. If this escalated to a legal confrontation, I wanted to be ready. Every ridiculous complaint she made was an opportunity to show her overreach, and I planned to use it. Despite the mounting tension, there was humor in the absurdity. Who else got fined for the direction their garden gnome was facing? Or for having a mailbox that didn't match some invisible standard? I joked to myself that I should start charging admission for the daily comedy show she provided, though I knew that in reality, this was serious business. It was clear that she wouldn't stop until she either broke me or proved herself right, but I also knew that her overconfidence was her weakness. Every over-the-top visit, every dramatic threat, and every unnecessary letter was a chance to expose just how far she was willing to go. The balance of power was shifting, and I was starting to feel that maybe, just maybe, I could turn her tactics against her. As I went to bed that night, I stared out at my land under the soft glow of the moon. It was peaceful, serene, untouched by the chaos Karen tried to bring, but I knew the next confrontation was coming. And this time, I wouldn't just stand there, I would fight back, carefully, strategically, and with every ounce of calm I could muster. The storm wasn't over, in fact, it was just beginning. By the time the weekend rolled around, I knew I couldn't just wait for Karen to strike again. I needed a plan. The letters, the inspections, the ridiculous fines, they weren't going to stop on their own. If I wanted to protect my land and my sanity, I had to be proactive. I decided it was time to dig into the rules, understand every nuance of the HOA regulations, and make sure I had all my bases covered. I spent hours going through the HOA bylaws, highlighting clauses, making notes, and even cross-referencing local property laws. It was tedious work but necessary. Every ambiguous sentence or vague guideline became a potential weapon against Karen's overreach. I began to see patterns in her behavior. She thrived on intimidation, confusion, and ambiguity. If I stayed organized and presented facts calmly, she wouldn't have the upper hand. I also started documenting her behavior more systematically. Every time she showed up unannounced, I took notes. Every unnecessary letter, every nonsensical complaint, everything was cataloged. Photos, videos, timestamps, all ready to be presented if the need arose. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and amusement every time I recorded her mid-rant. The woman was exhausting, but also predictably ridiculous. Neighbors became my quiet allies, though I didn't know if they realized it. Some offered advice, shared their own stories of dealing with HOA Karen, and even warned me not to underestimate her persistence. Others just watched from a distance, probably wondering how I managed to keep my cool while Karen stormed around like a general on a battlefield. I tried not to let them see how tense I really felt. I also started thinking strategically. Karen wanted drama, attention, and to feel in control. If I could remain calm, factual, and prepared, the drama would lose its power. I rehearsed what I would say in the next confrontation, anticipating her usual tactics: the smug smile, the waving of papers, the threats of fines and eviction. I planned to meet each move with calm, undeniable evidence of her overreach. There was also humor to be found if I allowed myself to see it. I imagined her marching up the driveway, waving her documents, and me standing there sipping coffee like I was waiting for a delivery. The thought made me smirk, and I realized that part of the battle was psychological. Staying calm in the face of her theatrics would frustrate her more than anything else. Of course, I couldn't let my guard down. Karen was cunning and persistent. She wasn't going to stop, and I had to be ready for anything. I made contingency plans in case she called the HOA officers again, noting every possible question they could ask and every answer I needed to have at the ready. I wanted to ensure that when the confrontation came, I would be unshakable. By the end of the weekend, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and readiness. The tension in the air was almost tangible, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable showdown. I knew Karen would come again, armed with threats and authority she did not truly possess. But I also knew I was ready. I had my facts, my documentation, my strategy, and my calm demeanor. Sitting on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees, I took a deep breath and looked over my land. This was mine. Every tree, every corner, every inch was legally and rightfully mine. Karen could try all she wanted, but she couldn't change that. The real power was in preparation, patience, and the quiet confidence of knowing I was on solid ground, both literally and legally. And deep down, I knew the moment of confrontation was approaching. I could almost feel it, like the tension before a storm breaks. Karen would come, she would try to intimidate, she would demand compliance. But this time, I would be ready. I would meet her theatrics with calm, her threats with facts, and her arrogance with quiet resolve. The game was about to change, and I was ready to play it. Monday morning arrived with the kind of quiet that made me uneasy. I had a feeling something big was coming, and sure enough, by mid-morning, Karen appeared again, this time with 2 HOA officers trailing behind her. She looked like she was walking onto a stage, papers in hand, ready to command an audience. My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to stay calm, reminding myself that I had prepared for this. Every document, every photo, every note of her overreach was ready, and I had rehearsed what I would say in my head 1,000 times. "Good morning," she announced loudly, practically beaming. "This property is in violation, and we are here to ensure compliance. You will vacate immediately." I stared at her, holding my coffee like a shield. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And what exactly are we complying with today?" The officers exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to her theatrics. Karen shoved her papers toward me dramatically, as if the weight of the stack would convince everyone she was right. I took them carefully, flipping through the pages. Most of it was the usual vague language and irrelevant complaints. I glanced at the officers and quietly explained my side, calmly presenting the proof of ownership, the records of proper maintenance, and the documentation of her prior harassment. Karen's smug expression faltered slightly. This doesn't matter. The HOA has authority and you must comply," she insisted. I smiled politely, holding up a folder with neatly organized evidence. "Actually, it does matter. According to HOA bylaws, the authority you're claiming isn't applicable in this case. Here's the proof." I could see her lips twitch as she realized that the officers were listening, actually listening to what I was saying. The tension in the air was thick. Karen started to raise her voice, trying to regain control. "You think you can just ignore HOA rules? Officers, do something." The officers hesitated, flipping through the papers she had brought. One of them cleared his throat. "These documents appear incomplete. Also, some of these claims don't align with the recorded regulations. We need clarification." I could barely hide my satisfaction. Karen's confidence, which had been so unshakable, was cracking. She tried to argue, tried to dominate, tried to intimidate, but every tactic was falling flat. Her theatrics, which worked so well on neighbors and unsuspecting residents, had no effect here. I remained calm, almost annoyingly calm, while she flailed. "Your property is your property," one officer finally said, handing the papers back. "But these claims of violations aren't enforceable as presented. You'll need to provide proper documentation next time." Karen's face went red. I swear I could see the steam coming out of her ears. She tried one last dramatic gesture, waving her hands like a conductor, shouting, "This isn't over, you'll regret this." I simply nodded politely, taking a slow sip of coffee. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone even. "Have a good day." The officers exchanged a look and started to guide Karen toward her car, still explaining the proper procedures she needed to follow. Karen stomped and sputtered, but their presence and authority were undeniable. For the first time, she wasn't the one in control. The absurdity of her previous attempts at intimidation was almost hilarious, except that it had cost me weeks of stress. The neighbors, who had been peeking over fences and through windows, started whispering among themselves. Some smiled, some shook their heads in disbelief, and I could hear faint chuckles as Karen argued her way toward the street. After she left, I stood on my porch, letting the adrenaline ebb. My land was still mine, untouched, unclaimed by her theatrics. I felt a mix of relief and cautious satisfaction. The confrontation was over for now, but I knew it wasn't the end. Karen would be back, and she wouldn't give up easily. Still, I had proven something important that day. Preparation, calm, and knowing your rights could turn even the most ridiculous threats into a victory. I watched as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across my property, and realized that this land, my land, was mine to protect, and I was ready for whatever came next. After the morning showdown, I thought I could finally breathe. For a few minutes, it felt like victory, like Karen's antics had been contained. But the truth was, the tension was far from over. I knew she would come back and probably even escalate. And sure enough, later that day, she appeared again, this time with a noticeably larger entourage of HOA officers. She looked like a general arriving at the battlefield, confident, commanding, and ready to enforce her will. I met her at the gate, keeping my posture relaxed, my hands visible and my tone steady. "Good afternoon," I said casually. "I see you brought reinforcements today." She scowled, waving the papers in her hand like a sword. "This property is in violation. You will comply immediately. The HOA officers here will ensure you do so." I raised an eyebrow and smiled faintly. "Once again, I'd like to see which specific regulations you believe I'm violating," I said. "I have all my documentation ready." The officers looked uncomfortable, shuffling their feet and whispering among themselves. They were clearly uncertain about Karen's authority and the legitimacy of her claims. I took a deep breath and calmly laid out my case: proof of ownership, detailed notes of her previous complaints, photos showing compliance with HOA rules, and a log of every unannounced visit. Every time she interrupted, I calmly countered with facts, refusing to get drawn into shouting or theatrics. Her confidence started to crack visibly. I noticed the slight twitch in her hands, the way her voice wavered when she tried to assert authority. She looked around, realizing that the officers were not just nodding politely, they were listening critically. Every word I spoke, every piece of evidence I presented, was undermining the empire she had built in her own mind. "Your claims are not substantiated," one of the officers finally said, holding up the stack of papers Karen had brought. "Several documents are incomplete, and some of these alleged violations have no legal basis." Karen's face turned red. She sputtered, attempting to assert control, but the officers continued to ask precise, pointed questions that exposed the flaws in her arguments. I stood quietly, letting the situation unfold. Her overconfidence had been her weapon, and now it had become her weakness. I could see her frustration building as her dramatic gestures became more frantic. She waved her arms, stomped her feet, and shouted over the officers, but each attempt only highlighted how unprepared she really was. Meanwhile, I stayed calm, polite, and factual, feeling a quiet satisfaction with every point she failed to support. Neighbors who had been watching from behind fences started to emerge slowly, their curiosity piqued. Some whispered, some laughed quietly, and others just shook their heads. It was almost like a spectacle, a comedy of errors played out by someone who thought she was untouchable. The officers finally turned to her and gave a firm, clear directive. "Ms. Karen, the evidence presented does not justify eviction or fines. You must leave the property now, or we will escort you off." Her protests grew louder, more frantic. "This is unfair. You can't just ignore the HOA rules. This isn't over." I remained calm, taking a slow sip of coffee I had set down nearby. "I'm happy to cooperate with legitimate procedures," I said evenly, "but I will not be intimidated by threats or theatrics." Her eyes narrowed, and I could see that moment when she realized her control was slipping away entirely. The officers moved closer, and she finally understood that this wasn't just a disagreement, it was a legal reality. My land, my rights, and the careful preparation I had done were stronger than her confidence and bluster. Finally, one of the officers gently but firmly guided her toward the street. She protested, shouted, and flailed, but it was useless. The situation had flipped completely. Karen, who had arrived expecting to dominate and intimidate, was now being escorted away. Her aura of authority had evaporated, leaving only frustration and disbelief. As the officers returned and assured me everything was in order, I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. The tension in the air slowly dissipated, replaced by a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and lingering adrenaline. For now, my land was safe, and the storm that Karen had tried to create had failed spectacularly. Standing on my porch, watching her retreat down the street, I couldn't help but smirk. She had underestimated me, and that mistake had cost her credibility, composure, and authority. I knew this wasn't the absolute end of her antics, but I also knew I was stronger, prepared, and ready for whatever came next. I thought the worst was over, but I knew better than to relax completely. Karen had a way of coming back when you least expected it, usually louder, more dramatic, and with more threats than before. I spent the morning keeping an eye out, making sure my documents were in order, and trying not to think too much about the adrenaline still buzzing through me. By mid-afternoon, she appeared again, this time alone, but with that familiar expression of outrage plastered across her face. She marched toward me, waving papers as though the sheer volume of them could make her right. "This is outrageous," she shouted. "You can't just ignore the HOA rules. I demand compliance." I watched her, calm as a still pond, and decided it was time to let the authorities finish what they had started. I had already called the local enforcement officers preemptively, explaining the situation, so they were on their way. Karen didn't know it yet, but this confrontation would finally end the way it should. She tried the usual intimidation tactics: sharp words, dramatic gestures, and threats of fines. She even stomped her foot as if that would somehow give her more power. But this time I didn't flinch. I smiled politely and said, "Karen, I've explained everything and the officers are on their way. I suggest you wait and discuss this calmly." She laughed at me, well, more like a snort of disbelief. "Calmly? I don't think you understand who you're dealing with." I just sipped my coffee, enjoying the tension for a brief moment. The absurdity of the scene wasn't lost on me. Karen, red-faced and furious, waving papers around like a conductor while I stood there, calm, composed, and utterly in control of the situation. Within minutes, the officers arrived. 2 SUVs pulled up and a handful of uniformed personnel stepped out, walking toward the property. Karen froze for a split second, clearly realizing she had escalated beyond her comfort zone. She tried to yell over the approaching officers, but they moved quickly, authoritative, and professional. "Ma'am," one officer said firmly, "we've been informed of the situation. You are being asked to leave this property immediately." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "This is you can't, I'm the HOA." The officers were unmoved. One gently took her arm and started guiding her toward the street while she continued to shout, flail, and argue. I could hear the neighbors gasping, whispering, some laughing quietly behind their fences. It was a spectacle, but this time the power had completely shifted. Karen's confidence, built on bluster and intimidation, had crumbled under calm logic and legal authority. I stayed on the porch, keeping my coffee in hand, watching as she was escorted down the driveway. Every stomp of her foot, every dramatic gesture only highlighted how ridiculous she looked. I could feel a mix of vindication and relief wash over me. After weeks of tension, letters, threats, and harassment, it was finally over, at least for now. Once she was safely escorted away, one officer came over and reviewed the situation. "Everything looks in order," he said. "We've documented the events, and she's been advised on proper procedures moving forward." I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. The adrenaline from the confrontation lingered, but it was different now, no longer fear or anxiety, but satisfaction. My land was safe, my rights upheld, and Karen had been exposed for what she truly was, someone who tried to wield power she didn't have and failed spectacularly. The neighbors slowly emerged, murmuring among themselves, congratulating me quietly or simply shaking their heads in disbelief at the drama they had just witnessed. I waved politely, feeling a mixture of relief and triumph. As I stood there looking over my land, I realized something important. This wasn't just about winning a confrontation. It was about standing up for yourself, knowing your rights, and refusing to be intimidated by someone else's sense of authority. Karen had thought she could control the situation through fear and overconfidence, but the truth had caught up with her. I finally set my coffee down and took a deep breath, savoring the quiet of my land. For the first time in weeks, it felt like mine again. Karen had tried to evict me from my own property, and instead, she had been the one escorted off. The tables had turned completely, and the satisfaction of that moment was indescribable. Even though I knew Karen might attempt some minor comeback, I also knew I had the preparation, calm, and support needed to handle it. For now, I could enjoy the peace I had fought so hard to protect, and that was a victory worth savoring. After Karen was escorted off my property, I finally had a moment to breathe. The adrenaline that had kept me alert for weeks began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of relief. For once, I could sit on my porch, look over my land, and feel like it was truly mine. No letters, no threats, no inspections from someone who thought she owned the place, just peace and maybe a little smug satisfaction. Of course, Karen wasn't completely gone. I knew she might try to stir trouble again, perhaps through more letters or complaints. But the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The officers had seen her overreach, my evidence had been undeniable, and the neighborhood had witnessed the entire ordeal. Karen's reputation had taken a hit, and even she knew it. For the first time, she realized that authority based on intimidation and bluster was fragile when faced with preparation, logic, and persistence. In the days that followed, life returned to something resembling normal. I tended to my garden, checked my pond, and mowed the lawn without the constant fear of a new fine landing in my mailbox. I even started talking to neighbors more openly, sharing stories of the absurd complaints and harassment I had endured. It became almost comical once you saw it from the outside. The mailbox fines, the gnome positioning, the hedge angle, all ridiculous, yet all part of the battle I had fought. Reflecting on the experience, I realized how much I had learned. First, always document everything, every interaction, every letter, every visit, keep records. They were what ultimately saved me and made Karen's threats meaningless. Second, stay calm. Karen thrived on fear and frustration. The moment I showed panic or anger, she thought she had won. Keeping a steady demeanor not only protected me but also made her lose credibility. And third, persistence pays off. It might take time to gather evidence, study regulations, and stand your ground, but the results are worth it. There were also moments of humor I couldn't ignore. I often laughed to myself thinking about Karen packing across the yard, waving papers, stomping her feet like a general in a battle she had already lost. The neighbors had seen it too, and I got quiet nods and smiles whenever we crossed paths. The absurdity of it all reminded me that even in tense, stressful situations, a little humor can keep you sane. I also realized that victory wasn't just about protecting my land. It was about reclaiming peace of mind. The confrontation had been exhausting mentally and emotionally, but the outcome reaffirmed something crucial. Knowing your rights, standing firm, and facing challenges with preparation and patience can make even the most intimidating situations manageable. As the weeks went by, I began to see a change in the neighborhood. The daily patrols and unnecessary inspections stopped. Karen no longer strutted around as if she owned the place, and the HOA seemed to tread more carefully, aware of the limits of their authority. I even started planting a few new trees, enjoying the quiet, confident that no one could disrupt the sanctuary I had fought so hard to protect. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the pond reflected the golden light, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee just as I had imagined in the beginning. This time it was different. There was no tension, no looming threats, no ridiculous fines hanging over my head. The land was mine, my rules, my peace. And after everything, the sense of triumph was deeply satisfying. The ordeal with Karen had been stressful, absurd, and at times infuriating, but in the end it was a story of resilience, preparation, and standing up for what's yours. I smiled as I watched the neighborhood settle into the evening quiet, realizing that I had won not just a legal battle but a personal one. My land, my rights, and my peace had been defended, and that was a victory worth savoring every single day. Even now, when I see someone walking by with a clipboard or a stack of papers, I can't help but chuckle quietly. The lesson is clear. Preparation, calm, and persistence beat intimidation every time. And sometimes, the person who thinks they're in control ends up being the one escorted off. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.